I buried my brother 35 years ago. His name was Edward James Calloway. Eddie, to everyone who loved him. He was 22 years old when the Bitterroot wildfire rolled over his crew's position on a ridge in western Montana during the summer of 1989. They told me 3 men didn't make it out. Eddie was one of them. I identified what was left of him at the county medical examiner's office in Missoula. I was 29 years old, and I had to drive home afterward and sit across from my mother at her kitchen table and tell her that her youngest son had burned to death in the mountains. Last month, on a Wednesday evening in October, my phone buzzed on the counter while I was washing dishes. Unknown number, Montana area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. At 64, I've learned to be suspicious of unknown callers, especially ones from states I haven't had reason to think about in years. But something stopped me. I still can't explain what it was. I dried my hands and answered. The voice on the other end was low and rough, the voice of a man who'd spent a lot of years outside in cold weather. It said, "Is this Frank Calloway?" I said yes. There was a pause so long I thought the call had dropped. Then the voice said, "Frank, I think I might be your brother." I set down the dish towel very carefully, the way you set things down when your hands have started shaking and you're afraid of dropping them. My wife Margaret was in the next room watching television. I could hear the murmur of it through the wall, the sound of ordinary life. "Eddie died in 1989, I said. My voice came out flat and strange, like I was reading from a card. "He died in a wildfire. I identified his remains myself." "I know," the voice said. "I know that's what the records say. But Frank, I've been having these dreams. For years, I've been having these dreams about a woman who used to sing when she did the dishes. Always the same song, something old. Something about a river." I sat down on the kitchen floor. "Because my mother used to sing when she did the dishes. Always the same song. An old folk song her own mother had taught her. Something about a river and a man who was coming home. She sang it every single time, every single evening, in the same low, absent-minded way, like she didn't even know she was doing it. It was so specific, so particular to her, so completely unremarkable in our childhood, that I had never once thought to mention it to anyone. Not in 35 years. Not ever. "Who are you?" I asked. "People call me Ray," he said. "Ray Decker. That's the name I've been going by. I live outside of Billings. But Frank, I found something. I found an old newspaper. There's a picture in it of the men who died in the Bitterroot fire, and one of those faces—" He stopped. I could hear him breathing. I look at that face every morning in the mirror. I told him to stay on the line. I walked into the living room and stood in front of Margaret until she muted the television and looked at me with the expression she gets when she knows something is wrong. I said, "I have to go to Montana." She stared at me. I said, "I think Eddie might be alive." She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Frank, sit down and tell me everything." I couldn't sit. I paced the living room for an hour, phone pressed to my ear, while Ray Decker told me what he knew about himself, which wasn't much. He knew he was somewhere around his mid to late 50s, though he couldn't be certain. He knew he'd been found wandering a rural highway outside of Deer Lodge, Montana, in the spring of 1991, 2 years after the fire, with no identification, severe scarring on his left arm and neck, and no memory of who he was or where he'd come from. A ranching family named Decker had taken him in while he recovered. He'd stayed. He'd become Ray. He'd worked on their property for years, then eventually drifted to Billings, done construction work, lived quietly. He'd seen doctors over the years who told him he had evidence of old head trauma consistent with a significant impact injury, possibly combined with smoke inhalation damage. His memory before 1991 was almost entirely gone. Not foggy, gone. But 6 months ago, a woman at the library where he volunteered on Tuesday afternoons had been going through a box of old newspaper clippings donated by a local historical society. She'd pulled one out and held it up and said, "Lord, look at this. 35 years ago this summer." It was an article about the Bitterroot fire. There were photographs of the 3 men who had died. One of them was named Edward Calloway, age 22, from Boise, Idaho. He told me he'd stood in that library aisle for 10 minutes, staring at that photograph. Then he'd carefully asked the woman if he could have the clipping. He'd taken it home and taped it to his bathroom mirror. And every morning for 6 months, he'd looked at the young face in that photograph and felt something move in him that he didn't have a word for. It took him 3 months to find my phone number. Another 3 to work up the nerve to dial it. I drove to Montana the next morning. It was a 7-hour drive from Boise through the high desert and up into the mountains, through country that gets more austere and more beautiful the further north you go. I left before dawn with a thermos of coffee and Margaret's voice in my ear telling me to be careful and to call her the moment I knew anything. I said I would. She'd wanted to come with me, and I'd talked her out of it, though I couldn't have explained why, except that something about this felt like it needed to be just me, at least at first. I had 6 hours of highway to think, and my mind went everywhere it shouldn't. I thought about the last time I'd seen Eddie alive, the morning he left for his second season on the Wildfire crew. He was standing in our mother's driveway with his gear bag over one shoulder, grinning that lopsided grin of his, telling Mom not to worry. He was good at fighting fires. He'd been doing it for 2 summers already. He knew what he was doing. Mom had hugged him for a long time and then pretended she wasn't crying as she waved him off. I'd punched him on the shoulder and told him to stop being a hero. He'd laughed and said he'd see me in September. I thought about the medical examiner's office in Missoula, the way the man behind the desk had looked at me with practiced sympathy, the forms I'd had to sign, the remains, which I cannot describe even now without something closing up in my chest, because a wildfire is not kind, and what it leaves behind is not what you want your last image of someone to be. But I had looked, because there was no one else to do it. Our father had been gone since Eddie was 12. Our mother was not capable of it, so I looked, and I said, yes, that's my brother, and I signed the forms, and I drove home, and I sat across from my mother at her kitchen table. What if I had been wrong? That question had been circling me since the moment I'd sat down on my kitchen floor the night before. What if in the chaos and the grief and the shock of that office, I had looked at what remained of a young man and seen what I expected to see, rather than what was actually there? The fire had been severe. The identification had not been easy. I remembered the medical examiner mentioning a dog tag, a partial one, that had been found near the remains, Eddie's name on it, or a version of his name, damaged enough that I'd filled in the rest myself. What if someone else's tag had ended up near the wrong body? What if my brother had been lying in a creek bed somewhere, unconscious and unaccounted for, while I was identifying someone else as him? The thought made me press the accelerator down and watch the speedometer climb. I found the address Ray Decker had given me on the outskirts of Billings, a small house in a neighborhood of small houses. The kind of place where people keep their yards tidy and their curtains drawn and don't bother one another much. I sat in the rental car for 5 minutes in front of it, engine idling. Then I got out. He answered the door before I knocked, which told me he'd been watching for me. And I stood on that small concrete step and looked at the man in the doorway, and my knees went strange beneath me. He was not Eddie. He could not have been Eddie, because Eddie was 22 years old and had a full head of brown hair and a grin that took up half his face. This man was somewhere in his late 50s, with hair that had gone entirely white and a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something that looked older than it probably was. He was thinner than Eddie had been, leaner through the shoulders, and he stood with the careful stillness of someone who'd learned to keep himself small. But the eyes. Eddie had our father's eyes. It was the thing people always said about him, because our father had unusual eyes, a shade of gray-green that didn't look quite real, the color of the ocean in winter. I had our mother's eyes, plain brown. Eddie had gotten the other ones, the interesting ones, and he'd always been slightly vain about it in the way only 22-year-olds can be vain about things they were simply born with. The man in the doorway had those eyes. The exact color, the exact shape, set in a weathered face 35 years older than the last time I'd seen them, but unmistakable. I couldn't speak. He said, "Frank." He said it quietly, like he was trying out the word, feeling its weight. I said, "Show me your arms." He blinked, then nodded slowly, and rolled up both sleeves. His left arm had extensive burn scarring running from just below the elbow to the wrist, old and settled into the skin. the kind of scar that had been there a very long time. His right forearm was unmarked, but on the inside of his right wrist, almost hidden in the fold of skin near the base of his palm, there was a small tattoo, faded almost beyond recognition, but still there, an outline of a hawk in flight, maybe an inch across. Eddie had gotten that tattoo the summer he turned 20, at a parlor in Boise with two of his buddies from the fire crew. Our mother had been furious. He'd laughed it off and told her it was a good luck charm. He'd been so pleased with himself about it. I made a sound I'm not going to try to describe. I grabbed the door frame to keep myself upright. Ray Decker, who might have been my brother, took one step forward and put a hand on my shoulder, steadying me, and that gesture, the ease of it, the automatic reach, was so completely Eddie that I felt something tear open in my chest. "Come inside," he said. I made coffee. We sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours. He told me about the years he could remember, the ones since 1991, and I told him about the brother I'd lost and the family that had come apart afterward. He listened to everything I said with an intensity that went beyond simple curiosity. He wasn't just hearing a story about someone else. He was looking for himself in it. When I described the way Eddie used to whistle while he worked, a habit so constant and so tuneless that it drove everyone around him crazy, Ray Decker went very quiet. Then he said, "People used to tell me that, at the ranch, that I whistled all the time without knowing it. When I described the way Eddie ate, which was fast and completely focused, like eating was a task to be completed efficiently rather than enjoyed, Ray smiled for the first time, and it was a small and careful smile, but I recognized the shape of it. When I described our mother's singing while she did the dishes, he looked down at his coffee cup and didn't say anything for a long time. I hear it in my sleep sometimes," he finally said. "I hear it, and I can feel the kitchen it was coming from. The smell of it. Old house, wood floors, something cooking on the stove. I always wake up feeling like I've been somewhere I needed to be." I was crying by then. I hadn't even noticed it starting. He told me about the day he was found, or what he'd been told about it, since he had no memory of it himself. A couple driving a rural highway early in the morning had found a man walking along the shoulder with no shoes and no shirt, badly disoriented, his left arm and neck severely burned. He'd been taken to a hospital in Deer Lodge, where he'd been treated for the burns and for what the doctors described as significant neurological trauma. He hadn't been able to say his name, hadn't been able to give any information at all. The hospital had checked missing persons reports and found nothing that matched. The Decker family, who were known to the hospital staff as decent people, had offered to take him in during his recovery. He'd stayed for 11 years. "Why didn't you ever try harder to find out who you were?" I asked. Not accusingly, just because I needed to understand. He thought about it for a moment. "I did, for a while," he said. "But there wasn't much to go on, and after a few years, Ray Decker started to feel like who I actually was. It's easier to be someone than to be no one, and I suppose some part of me was afraid of what I might find. If you have no past, you don't have to mourn it. I understood that better than I wanted to. I drove to a lab in Billings that afternoon. It took some searching on my phone to find one that did relationship DNA testing, and the woman on the phone explained that they could process a sibling test in 5 to 7 business days, or 3 with the expedited option. I paid for the expedited option without thinking twice. We went together, Ray and I, in my rental car, barely speaking on the way there. The lab was in a medical building downtown, unremarkable and clean. A technician took cheek swabs from both of us and gave me a form with a case number on it. She said I'd receive the results by email, and they'd also call. I sat in the parking lot afterward and stared at the steering wheel. "What if it comes back negative?" Ray said. "Then we'll know," I said. "Will you be relieved or disappointed?" I thought about that honestly. "Both," I said, "depending on what you mean." He nodded slowly, like that made sense to him. I'd booked a motel room near downtown, and I offered to pay for one for him as well, but he said he was fine at home, that he'd slept in worse places than his own bed, and there was no sense in wasting money. That frugality, that particular quiet stubbornness about not accepting more than was strictly necessary, was so reminiscent of something in my mother's character that I had to look out the window for a moment. We had dinner at a diner near the motel that evening, a place with red vinyl booths and a laminated menu and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since noon. We talked for 4 hours. He told me about the years on the Decker Ranch, about learning to do things with his hands that he seemed to already know how to do, about the strange competence he'd had around fire. Of all things, how he'd been the one they always called to manage the controlled burns on the property, how he'd felt at ease with it, in a way he couldn't explain. A man with severe fire-related injuries who was mysteriously at ease around fire. The psychology of that seemed worth examining, but we didn't have the language for it that night. He told me about the years in Billings, the construction work, the quiet apartment, the library volunteering that had started 5 years ago when he'd found himself needing something to do with his Tuesdays. He'd always been a reader, he said. He didn't know where that had come from. Eddie had been a reader. It was one of the things that surprised people about him, because he was big and physical and spent his summers fighting wildfires. But he always had a book somewhere on his person. Westerns, mostly, and histories of the American West, which he read with the intensity of someone conducting research. I told Ray this. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a paperback, worn nearly to pieces, the spine cracked and taped back together. It was a history of the Lewis and Clark expedition. I excused myself and went to the men's room and stood at the sink with the water running and breathed until I could go back out and sit down without falling apart completely. Those 3 days in Billings were the strangest of my life. We fell into an odd rhythm, Ray and I, meeting for meals, driving out to see parts of the landscape that seemed to draw him, talking for hours about everything and nothing. I called Margaret every evening and tried to describe what was happening, and she listened and asked careful questions and told me she loved me and to trust what I was feeling. She's wiser than I am. She always has been. On the second day, I asked him if he'd ever married, had children. He shook his head. Came close once, he said. Woman I was with for about 6 years when I was on the ranch. She wanted a family, and I couldn't figure out how to explain to her that I didn't know who I was, that something in me felt unresolved in a way that wasn't fair to her. He paused. She married someone else. Good man. They have 3 kids. I thought about the family Eddie had never had a chance to build, the life that had been interrupted at 22 and never resumed. If this was Eddie, then he'd lost not just his memory, but the decades that should have followed it, the relationships, the children, the accumulation of ordinary things that make up a life. He'd spent those decades as Ray Decker, a man shaped by other people's charity and his own quiet endurance, never knowing what he'd been before. On the second afternoon, I took out my phone and pulled up the photographs I'd brought with me. Pictures of our mother, of our childhood home in Boise, of family Christmases and summer vacations and backyard gatherings. I showed them to him slowly, watching his face. At most of the pictures, nothing. Polite interest. The look of someone examining photographs of strangers. But when I got to a picture of our mother in her kitchen, standing at the sink with her back to the camera, taken on a Sunday morning when Eddie would have been about 15 and I was 22, Ray Decker went very still. He took the phone from me and held it, staring at it. That's the kitchen, he said quietly. That's the kitchen I dream about. The results came on Thursday afternoon, 3 days after the swabs. I was in my motel room when my phone rang, and I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the unknown number for one full ring before I answered. A woman introduced herself from the DNA laboratory and told me she was calling to discuss my results. I said I was ready, though I wasn't. No one is ready for something like that. She said, Mr. Calloway, the analysis of your DNA sample and the sample submitted as Ray Decker is conclusive. The probability of a full sibling relationship between yourself and the second party is 99.94%. You share both a maternal and paternal genetic profile consistent with full biological brothers. The room was very quiet. Outside, someone in the parking lot was unloading groceries from a car, talking to a child about something, an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary world. Full brothers, I said. Yes, sir. Full biological brothers. There's no statistical ambiguity in these results. Would you like me to send the report to the email you provided? I gave her the email address and thanked her and sat on the edge of the motel bed for what felt like a long time but was probably only a few minutes. Then I called Ray. He answered on the first ring, which told me he'd been sitting with his phone in his hand waiting, the same way I'd been sitting with mine. I said, "It's you. You're Eddie. The test is definitive." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I said his name twice, first Ray and then Eddie, uncertain which one to use, uncertain which one he'd respond to. Then I heard him make a sound, not quite a word, something lower and rougher than a word, and I understood that he was crying. 99.94%, I said, because I wanted him to have the number, wanted him to be able to hold on to something that specific and certain. "We're full brothers, Eddie. Same mother, same father. There's no question." I heard him breathe. Then he said, "I knew. When you showed me that picture of her at the sink, I knew." I drove to his house. He was on the front step when I pulled up, sitting with his elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. He looked up when I got out of the car, and his face was the face of a man who has just been handed back, something he thought was gone forever and doesn't quite know how to hold it yet. I sat down next to him on the step. Two old men on a concrete step in a quiet neighborhood in Billings, Montana, on a Thursday afternoon in October. "Mom's gone," I said. I needed to say it directly, the way I had needed to say it to the man I thought might be his ghost. She died 9 years ago. Went in her sleep, which was a mercy. She never stopped grieving you, Eddie. Not ever. Not for a single year. He looked out at the street. I watched his throat move. "She kept your room," I said. "Even after she sold the house, she kept a box of your things. Books. That dumb little trophy from the 4th grade spelling bee. A flannel shirt. I still have the box." "The spelling bee," he said. And something crossed his face, a flicker, there, and gone, like a light seen through a window from a moving car. "I came in second," he said slowly. "The year before, I got runner-up, and then the next year I won. I remember being angry about the runner-up. Mom said I was a sore loser, and I told her." He stopped. His eyes went wide. "What did you tell her?" I asked, keeping my voice very quiet. "That second place was first loser." He looked at me. She laughed. She laughed so hard she had to sit down. He pressed his hand over his eyes. I can hear her laughing. We sat on that step for another hour. The memories came back in fragments, small and specific, out of order, the way dreams do. The sound of our mother's laugh, the smell of the garage where our father used to keep his tools before he left, the particular rattle of the screen door at the back of the house. A dog named Chester who'd lived to 17 and died in the summer before Eddie left for his first fire season. An old dog, a patient dog, who'd slept at the foot of Eddie's bed for as long as either of us could remember. He remembered Chester. He had to describe him before I told him the name, because I wanted to hear it, wanted to know if the memory was his own and not something I was giving him. He said there was a dog, big and brown, slow in its old age, always near him. I asked him what the dog smelled like. He said, like outside an old carpet. He was right. He was exactly right. That evening I called a doctor whose name I'd gotten from a specialist at a hospital in Boise, a man in Billings who worked with neurological trauma and memory disorders. His name was Dr. Arthur Mead, and he agreed to see us the next morning as a professional courtesy. Because I called and told him the situation, and he said he'd never heard anything quite like it, and that was reason enough. Dr. Mead was a careful man in his early 60s, compact and precise, with reading glasses he took on and off as he talked. He spent 2 hours examining Eddie, reviewing what records existed, asking detailed questions. He checked the scarring, the healed injuries, the depression in the skull he found along the occipital ridge, consistent with a severe impact. He looked at Eddie's eyes with an ophthalmoscope for a long time. When we sat down together afterward, he folded his hands on the desk and spoke plainly, which I appreciated. He said that in his professional opinion, what had most likely happened was this. Eddie had survived the initial fire event, possibly by instinct or training, by finding a low point, a ditch, or a creek bed and getting below the worst of the heat. But he'd sustained a serious head injury, likely from being struck by debris or thrown by a pressure change in the fire's air movement. He'd also sustained the burns to his left arm and neck, and possibly other injuries not visible without further imaging. In the chaos of a large wildfire at night, in rough terrain, it was not difficult to imagine how a survivor could end up separated from the recovery zone, especially one who was unconscious or severely disoriented. The misidentification of the body, Dr. Mead said, was an entirely plausible consequence of the circumstances. Remains recovered from a wildfire, after a cold night at altitude, from a crew where the members were of similar age and build, a brother who was 29 and in shock, a partial dog tag, the expectation, in grief, of seeing what you came to see. None of that was anyone's failure. It was the brutal mathematics of a bad situation. As for the 35 years of memory loss, he said, some of it might return, some of it likely would not. The kind of neurological damage Eddie had sustained, compounded by years of improperly treated head trauma and what sounded like significant physical and psychological stress in the intervening years, had left permanent changes in the structures of memory, formation, and retrieval. He would likely continue to have flashes, specific sensory memories triggered by smell or sound or image, the way he'd remembered the dog, the spelling bee, our mother's laugh, but he would probably not recover a continuous narrative of his early life. He would never be 22 again, inside his own memory. He would have to build his past out of what other people gave him, stories told by his brother, photographs, the cardboard box I'd described with his books, and his trophy, and his flannel shirt. That's not nothing, Dr. Mead said. That's actually quite a lot. Memory is more collaborative than we usually admit. Most of what we remember partly because other people helped us remember it. I asked him about therapy. He gave me 3 names and said the most important thing was to give Eddie time and to resist the urge to overwhelm him with information too quickly. 35 years was a long time. Trying to compress it into a few weeks would not help anyone. I asked him one more thing before we left. The man whose remains had been buried in Eddie's place, in a grave with Eddie's name on it, in a cemetery in Boise. I had been thinking about this since the moment I understood what had happened. Someone was in that grave, someone whose family might still be looking for him, or might have given up looking, or might themselves be gone. It seemed important. It seemed like the thing I could not leave unresolved. Dr. Mead said that was a matter for law enforcement and a forensic genealogist, and that he could point me toward the appropriate channels if I chose to pursue it. He said it gently, because he understood what it meant for my family to open that door. But he also said that whoever lay in that grave had a name, had people, had a history that deserved to be known. I had already known I was going to make those calls. I just needed someone to confirm that it was the right thing to do. I did make those calls over the weeks that followed, and the process was long and not without its complications, and ultimately, 3 months later, the remains were identified through forensic DNA analysis as belonging to a young man named Carl Whitmore, 20 years old, from Spokane, Washington, who had been on the same fire crew as Eddie and who had been listed as missing since 1989. His mother was still alive, 81 years old, living in a care facility outside of Spokane. A social worker sat with her when she was told. She cried, and then she said she'd always known he was somewhere. She'd always felt it. She asked if she could have something to bury, something with his name on it, and we arranged that she could. That part of the story doesn't belong to me to tell in full, but I'll say that knowing she had that knowledge at the end of her life felt like a debt I needed to help pay. Eddie came to Boise in November. He rode the bus, because he said he'd always found buses comfortable and restful, which struck me as an interesting thing to say, and which I chose not to examine too closely. Margaret picked him up at the station while I was at work, and I came home to find the two of them at the kitchen table with cups of tea, and what appeared to be a very involved conversation about the history of the American West, because Eddie had been carrying that worn paperback history of Lewis and Clark, and Margaret had her own opinions about the subject. I stood in the kitchen doorway watching them, and felt something settle in my chest that I didn't have a name for. Some combination of grief and gratitude, so mixed together they were indistinguishable. It has not been easy. I want to be clear about that, because it would be dishonest to make it sound simple. Eddie, who spent 35 years being Ray Decker, he moves through the house with the careful courtesy of a guest who is uncertain of the rules. He is not accustomed to being cared for. He is not accustomed to having people cook for him and ask him how he slept and save him the last of the coffee. Small kindnesses make him uncomfortable, and he has to fight the instinct to deflect them. He sees a therapist named Dr. Hernandez twice a week, a woman who specializes in identity reconstruction and complex trauma, and he comes home from those sessions wrung out and quiet. And on the evenings after his appointments, he sits on the back porch with a blanket around his shoulders and looks at the yard until dinner. But he goes. He goes every time, and he does the work. And some weeks he comes back and tells me something he remembered, something new, and the look on his face when it happens is unlike anything I can describe. He remembered our father leaving, not the facts of it, which I'd told him, but the feeling of it, the particular silence that had settled over the house afterward, the way our mother had moved through that silence for months like someone navigating a room full of furniture in the dark. He'd told Dr. Hernandez about it before he told me, and she'd asked him to describe the feeling as he experienced it now, as a man in his late 50s, not as the 12-year-old boy who'd lived through it. He told me later that he'd cried for a long time in that office, and that it was the first time he'd cried and known exactly what he was crying about. My daughters met him at Thanksgiving. I'd warned them, carefully and at length, about what to expect, about who he was and wasn't, about the fact that calling him Uncle Eddie was both accurate and complicated. They're good women, my daughters. They brought their families, and they treated him with a kind of careful warmth, asking him questions about his work and his interests, not pushing, not making too much of anything. My younger daughter's husband, who had never met Eddie, told me privately that evening that he'd noticed Ray, as he kept almost calling him, had the same way of listening as me, a particular stillness and attentiveness, and that it was both uncanny and reassuring to see. My grandson, who was 8, decided within 20 minutes of meeting Eddie that he was interesting because Eddie knew a lot about birds and could identify most of the ones that came to the backyard feeder by sight and sound, a skill he'd apparently acquired somewhere in his years on the ranch in Montana and retained even when most everything else was lost. My grandson now texts Eddie photographs of birds from his backyard and waits with what I'm told is impressive patience for the identifications. Eddie smiles differently than he did at 22. I can see it in the old photographs, that wide, uncomplicated grin, the face of a young man who hadn't yet learned that the world could take everything from you in a single night. The smile he has now is quieter and rarer and a little crooked, and it shows up most when he's watching my grandson describe something, or when Margaret says something dryly funny, which she does regularly, or when he's out in the backyard in the early morning with a cup of coffee, and the birds are loud, and the light is doing something particular with the leaves on the trees. I watch him when he doesn't know I'm watching, sometimes. I look at this man who is my brother and who is also a stranger, and I try to reconcile what I see with the 22-year-old I buried in memory a long time ago, and mostly I cannot. They are the same person the way a tree is the same tree over 35 years. The roots are the same, the wood is the same wood, but nothing looks the way it did, and the shape of the growth was determined entirely by conditions neither of you chose. There is a headstone in a cemetery in Boise with Eddie's name on it. We've talked about what to do with it. He went to see it last month. His first time at that cemetery, on a gray afternoon in December when the light was flat and cold. I drove him there and waited by the car while he walked down the path to the section I directed him to. I watched him from a distance, watched him stand in front of that stone for a long time. I don't know what he was thinking. When he came back to the car, I didn't ask. He got in and looked straight ahead and said, "It's a good stone. She picked a good one. Our mother had chosen it." He knew that because I'd told him. We decided eventually to have a small plaque added to the stone's base, not removing anything, not pretending the grief of those 35 years didn't happen, because it did, and it was real, and it deserves to be acknowledged, but adding a line, something that tells the truth. We haven't found the exact words yet. We're working on it together. Some nights I lie awake and I let myself think about the years. All of them, every single one. The birthdays Eddie wasn't there for. The holidays where his absence was a shape at the table that never quite filled in. My daughters growing up without an uncle. Our mother aging without her youngest son. The conversations I might have had with him about our father, about growing older, about the things men talk about when they've known each other long enough to have run out of the easy topics and started on the real ones. I think about all of it. And then I get to the part where I almost didn't answer the phone. At 64, you've learned that nothing good comes from unknown numbers on a Wednesday evening. That's what I thought when I saw it come up on my screen. I had the phone in my hand and I almost set it back down on the counter and went back to the dishes. I answered because of something I can't name. Not instinct, not premonition, nothing mystical. Just the simple fact that my hand moved before my mind caught up with it, and the call connected, and a rough voice said my name in the dark. Eddie said something to me recently. On a night when we were both up late, him with his Lewis and Clark book and me with a glass of water, sitting in the kitchen the way we used to sit when we were young, though neither of us consciously planned it that way. He said he'd spent 35 years feeling like he was waiting for something, some signal that never came, some piece of information that would make the present make sense. He said even in his years as Ray Decker, when he'd mostly stopped actively trying to recover his past, there had always been this low, persistent feeling of incompleteness, like a song he knew the melody to but couldn't remember the words. I asked him if that feeling was gone now. He thought about it. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside a car passed. Not gone, he said, but different. Now I know what the song is. I have spent a lot of years believing that grief was something you carried forever, unchanging, the way a stone is unchanging. You picked it up the day you lost someone and you carried it from that point forward and it never got lighter, you just got stronger, or you didn't. I believed that. It seemed true to me. I don't know what to believe now. I know that my brother is alive. I know that my mother died not knowing it, and I will carry that particular weight for the rest of my life, the unfairness of it, the unnecessary grief of 35 years of her life. I know that a young man named Carl Whitmore from Spokane was identified and returned to his mother, and that her remaining months will be different because of it, not better exactly, but more complete. I know that a man who spent decades not knowing his own name now knows it. I know that on Christmas morning this year, Eddie sat at our table with my family around him, my daughters and their husbands and my grandson who talks too much about birds. And he ate Margaret's cooking, and he told a story about something that had happened on the ranch in Montana years ago, something funny, a story I'd never heard, a story from the life he'd lived without me. And I listened to my brother tell me something I didn't know about him, and I thought, there will be more of those. There are years ahead of us yet. Not the years we lost. Those are gone and they were real, and the loss was real, but other years, whatever comes next. He helped me with the dishes afterward. The way our mother always made us do. Together, one washing and one drying. Neither of us suggested it. We just both ended up at the sink, and I washed, and he dried, and Margaret put on music in the other room, and outside it was cold and gray the way December afternoons are in Idaho, and Eddie started whistling, low and tuneless, without knowing he was doing it, the way he always had. The way that had driven every person who'd ever lived with him half to distraction. I didn't say anything about it. I just stood at the sink with the warm water running over my hands and listened to my brother whistle, and outside the window the light was going from gray to almost gold, the way it does sometimes just before dark, sudden and brief and unrepeatable. And I thought, that's enough. After everything, that's more than enough. That's everything.